When wolves turned on soldiers, the forgotten horror of World War II in the frozen wilderness of the Eastern Front. The winter of 1941 to 1942 became one of the most brutal seasons humanity had ever faced. The world was already tearing itself apart, and yet, in those endless snows, another enemy was waiting. Not soldiers, not tanks, but wolves. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, had begun just months earlier. Millions of men marched east into a land of forests, marshes, and bitter cold. By the time winter came, the fighting had slowed to a crawl. Machine guns froze, fuel solidified, and men froze to death in their sleep. But something else was happening, something that both German and Soviet soldiers would later recall with fear. The wolves were coming back. Before the war, much of the wildlife in Eastern Europe had already been hunted or driven away by human activity. But when entire villages were destroyed and civilians fled or were killed, vast regions became silent. The forest grew wild again, and the wolves returned to territory they hadn't roamed freely in for centuries. Normally, wolves avoid humans, but that winter, food was gone. Deer and elk had fled the gunfire. Livestock had been slaughtered or abandoned, and in the snow-covered battlefields lay something wolves could smell for miles: the bodies of soldiers. At first, they scavenged at night, drawn to the scent of death. Soldiers wrote about hearing distant howls echoing through the frozen trees, but as the cold deepened and hunger set in, their behavior changed. The wolves began to follow troop movements and to attack. In diaries recovered after the war, both German and Soviet soldiers described the same terrifying scenes. Men on night watch spotting dark shapes moving in the snow. A single pair of glowing eyes, then more, a pack. Gunfire cracking through the air, followed by silence and the faint sound of howling returning once more. One Soviet account from near Leningrad tells a supply convoy ambushed not by enemy troops, but by a pack of starving wolves. By the time reinforcements arrived, several horses were dead and 2 soldiers had vanished. Only their rifles and bloodstains remained. On the German side, similar reports emerged from the forest near Smolensk and Pskov, where soldiers patrolling isolated roads were surrounded by wolves so aggressive that local officers organized joint hunts to drive them away. And in rare moments of surreal cooperation, Soviet and German soldiers even called temporary truces, laying down their weapons to fight a common enemy. Imagine it, men who would kill each other minutes later, standing shoulder to shoulder, rifles aimed into the night, firing at packs of starving beasts circling just beyond the light of their fires. By February 1942, the problem had become serious enough that both the Soviet government and German command reportedly authorized organized wolf hunts. Bounties were issued, teams of soldiers, hunters, and even villagers were sent into the forest to thin out the packs. Hundreds of wolves were killed, but it made little difference. The war had turned the land into an open graveyard. The more men who died, the more food there was for scavengers, and the wolves adapted quickly, following retreating units, lurking near trenches and prowling around field hospitals after dark. There are stories difficult to verify, but passed down by survivors, of wolves entering abandoned bunkers, tearing into frozen corpses, and even dragging away wounded men left behind after battles. In the chaos of the Eastern Front, where tens of millions perished, such horrors easily disappear beneath the greater nightmare of war itself. But local villagers remembered. In rural Russian Belarus, tales persisted long after the war. Stories of the winter of the hungry wolves, when people dared not step outside after sunset. It wasn't the Germans or the Soviets they feared most. It was the eyes that glowed from the tree line. By the end of the war, in 1945, the balance began to shift again. With the front lines moving west and millions of soldiers gone, the forest slowly refilled with game. The wolves, no longer desperate, retreated once more from human settlements. But for years after, the scars remained, both in the memories of those who had seen it and in official records. Soviet archives from the 1940s and 1950s reference large-scale wolf control operations across western Russia, with some regions reporting an explosion in wolf populations right after the war, a direct consequence of the unnatural feast the war had provided. Even today, historians debate how widespread these wolf attacks truly were. Some dismiss them as campfire tales told by traumatized soldiers. Others point to military records and local reports that clearly document coordinated hunts and truce events between German and Soviet troops. The truth may lie somewhere in between, part legend, part grim reality. But in the winter of 1941, when humanity was at its breaking point, nature itself turned savage. In the end, the wolves were just trying to survive like everyone else. The war didn't just pit man against man. It pitted all living things against extinction. And in that frozen nightmare, the line between predator and prey blurred completely. When men went to war, the wolves followed. And long after the guns fell silent, their howls still echoed through the forests of the Eastern Front, a haunting reminder that, in the depths of desperation, the wilderness always remembers. If you found this story haunting, don't forget to subscribe for more untold chapters of history, where the truth is often stranger and darker than fiction.